Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into a set of very old stories. The kind people in ancient Greece told each other when they were bored, confused, or just wanted to explain why life felt like a cosmic inside joke. Don't worry, we're not dealing with gods or anything that conflicts with real beliefs. These are just characters, old literature, people whose lives were so messy that even modern soap operas would politely step aside. So settle in, relax your shoulders, maybe loosen the blanket around you like you're reclining in some imaginary ancient symposium chair, preferably one without fleas. And let's drift into the beautifully dysfunctional world of Greek tragic heroes. Because if there's one thing the ancient Greeks loved, it was watching perfectly normal people make catastrophically bad life choices. And honestly, same. Achilles, the man who could survive anything except his own mood. Let's start with Achilles. Not a god, not immortal, just a guy who happened to be really good at fighting and really terrible at emotional regulation. People talk about Achilles like he was this unbeatable warrior, but if you actually read the old stories, you quickly discover he was basically the ancient Greek equivalent of that one friend who storms off dramatically whenever things don't go their way. Achilles supposedly had a prophecy hanging over him: short life, great glory. Which sounds deep, until you realize the Greeks basically invented the art of making everything unnecessarily poetic. And Achilles leaned all the way into it. He fought like someone who had already accepted his tragic ending and wanted to make sure the universe remembered his name in sparkly letters. Of course he was dramatic. Of course he was intense. Of course he refused to compromise on anything, ever. His biggest fight wasn't even with an enemy soldier. No, it was with his own commander, Agamemnon, because Agamemnon took Achilles' war prize. Ancient Greeks, inventors of the messy workplace feud. Achilles then did what any mature adult would do in a time of war. He quit. He just quit the entire Trojan War. Imagine the battlefield, everyone panicking and Achilles sitting in his tent, basically saying, "Not my problem, I'm on break." The war literally fell apart because one guy had a bad day. And yet people adored him. Because of course they did. Ancient literature has always had a soft spot for emotionally unstable main characters. Agamemnon, the king who should have stayed home. Now let's float over to Agamemnon, the man who technically led the Greek army, but honestly should not have been given responsibility over anything more important than a garden hose. Agamemnon's life was a long string of unfortunate decisions, like he was speed-running the How to Ruin Everything challenge. To even start the war, he had to deal with unfavorable winds. And the storytellers said he solved this by offering a terrible sacrifice. But again, this is mythology. Just a story. Not real. Not endorsed. Ancient people wrote all kinds of dramatic things to justify war. Anyway, Agamemnon goes to Troy, fights for 10 years, causes massive chaos, and finally comes home, only for his return to go spectacularly wrong because his wife, Clytemnestra, had some very legitimate grievances. Let's just say the homecoming was not the cheerful family reunion he might have imagined. Agamemnon's entire story feels like a cosmic reminder that being in charge doesn't automatically mean you're good at anything. Odysseus, the man who took 10 years to do a 30-day trip. Next, let's drift gently toward Odysseus, probably the only man in ancient storytelling whose travel delays make modern airline problems look efficient. Odysseus was smart, sharp, strategic, the kind of guy who could talk his way out of anything, except, apparently, getting home in a timely manner. He left Troy thinking he'd be back in Ithaca in no time. Instead, 10 years. 10 years. You could finish several degrees in that time. You could raise a child from kindergarten to high school. And meanwhile, Odysseus is wandering around the sea, getting stuck on islands, running into monsters, dealing with storms, and making a bunch of questionable decisions. Every time he got close to going home, something happened. A storm, a distraction, a weird island with weird people. Basically, the ancient equivalent of Google Maps rerouting. His wife, Penelope, waited patiently all those years, weaving, unweaving, reweaving, because in old Greek stories, the women usually had to carry the emotional weight of everyone else's nonsense. Odysseus finally made it home, exhausted, traumatized, and probably smelling like decade-old seawater. And somehow people treat him like a symbol of loyalty and perseverance. Probably because they never had to sit next to him on a boat. Oedipus, the original king of unintentional mistakes. Now let's float slowly to Thebes, home to perhaps the most famously unlucky man the Greeks ever imagined, Oedipus. Before we start, a reminder. This is literature, mythological storytelling, not real, not religious, just a very dramatic ancient play about fate, ignorance, and the dangers of overthinking. Oedipus was basically the poster child for no matter what you do, the universe is going to misunderstand your intentions. He tried his best. He really did. He left home to avoid fulfilling a terrible prophecy, only to accidentally fulfill it because, well, Greek storytelling loved irony more than modern teenagers love plot twists. He solved a riddle. He became a king. He tried to save his city. And everything still fell apart. If Achilles was the king of anger, Odysseus the king of delays, then Oedipus was the king of tragic misunderstandings. The kind you wish someone would have solved by just giving the man a clear map and a therapist. Jason, the hero who couldn't commit to anything except bad ideas. Let's gently slide over to Jason, leader of the Argonauts. He's remembered for a grand adventure to fetch the Golden Fleece, but honestly, he could have been remembered for something far more accurate. Jason and the absolutely chaotic leadership decisions. Jason gathered heroes from all over Greece, promising glory, honor, and adventure. But he forgot the crucial step, actually being a good leader. Most of the successes of the expedition happened because other people did the work. Heracles, he did a lot. Orpheus, he helped with music and monsters. And Medea, well, Medea basically carried the entire quest on her back. Jason later abandoned Medea, proving that ancient literature had a recurring theme. If there was ever a way for a male hero to ruin his own life through emotional stupidity, he would find it. Jason's story is the ancient equivalent of someone who gets famous for a group project he barely contributed to. Medea, the woman who deserved a better life. Let's drift softly toward Medea, a character who, in modern terms, would probably have become a legendary psychologist or scientist if she hadn't been written by poets who really enjoyed tragedy. Medea was brilliant. She was strategic. She saved Jason's life multiple times. She left her home for him. And in return, Jason traded her in for political convenience. In ancient plays, Medea becomes the embodiment of heartbreak turning into rage, but in a sad, quiet, slow-burning way that tells you more about ancient social expectations than anything else. She was one of the few mythological characters who seemed fully aware of the emotional gaps in the people around her. She deserved a far calmer story than she got tea. And as we keep drifting along this cozy river of ancient storytelling, we eventually bump into another set of humans who really should have had someone, anyone, step in and say, hey, maybe don't do that. But the ancient Greeks didn't really do interventions. They just turned everyone's bad choices into poetry. Take poor Narcissus, for example, A man who wasn't a hero, wasn't a king, wasn't even particularly accomplished. He was just very pretty. That was his whole personality, his entire resume. If he had a LinkedIn page, it would have been one line: skill, being attractive. And honestly, he wasn't even nice about it. The stories portray him as someone who rejected everyone with such bored disdain that it's almost impressive. Different versions of the story say different things, but they all revolve around this idea that he became obsessed with his own reflection, which, if you think about it, is the ancient Greek version of scrolling through your own Instagram feed for too long and deciding no one else is worthy. Except in the myth, this leads to Narcissus essentially wasting away by a pool. It's meant to be poetic, tragic, symbolic, but it also sounds exactly like what happens when someone takes self-love a little too literally. And then there's Phaedra, whose story feels like the writers sat down and said, "What is the most emotionally complicated situation we can design?" She was a queen, married to the famously complicated Theseus, but she developed a forbidden and disastrous affection for Hippolytus, Theseus' son from another woman. Now, Phaedra wasn't evil. She wasn't scheming. She was just a character written into a narrative that specialized in turning inner conflict into catastrophic outcomes. Her life reads like a long meditation on guilt, suppressed emotions, and the unfortunate consequences of being trapped inside a tragic play written by someone who clearly needed a long nap and better coping mechanisms. And speaking of Theseus, he's another one who really should have stayed at home instead of adventuring. The ancient storytellers loved him because he was strong and clever, but if you take a slow, relaxed look at his life, you realize he made an astonishing number of questionable choices. Leaving Ariadne alone on an island after she helped him survive the labyrinth, not a great moment. Accidentally causing the death of his own father by forgetting to change his ship's sails from black to white. Also not ideal. Theseus is what happens when someone tries to be a hero, but forgets that heroism also requires basic communication skills. But since we're already drifting through stories of people whose lives spiraled despite their best intentions, it feels fitting to glide gently toward Philoctetes. He was a skilled archer, one of the best in Greek stories, but his journey took a strange, lonely turn. On the way to Troy, he suffered a wound, one so foul-smelling that the rest of the Greek army abandoned him on a deserted island. Imagine traveling with a group of people who claim they need you for a great war, but as soon as you get an infected injury, everyone votes to leave you behind like they're taking out the trash. Philoctetes lived alone for years, surviving through pain and sheer stubbornness. And then, because Greek stories enjoy irony, those same soldiers later realized they couldn't win the war without him. So they came back awkwardly, like someone who ghosted you months ago, and then suddenly decides they need help moving furniture. Philoctetes did eventually rejoin them, but the emotional damage had already been done. His story is quiet, slow, and strangely tender in a way Greek myths rarely are. It's about abandonment and the complicated calculus of forgiveness. And while we're on the topic of quiet sadness, Iphigenia drifts into view. Ancient storytellers often used her as the symbol of innocence caught in the machinery of other people's ambitions. Different versions of her story survive, but they revolve around the idea that she became a victim of decisions made by powerful men who saw her life as a tool. There's something unsettlingly modern about that, a reminder that tragedy isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, almost gentle, disguised as duty or necessity. Iphigenia's story doesn't shout, it just lingers, a soft ache rather than a dramatic wound. And then there's Cassandra, perhaps one of the most quietly heartbreaking characters the Greeks ever imagined. She wasn't a warrior or a queen or someone who tried to defy fate. She just had a gift, the ability to foresee the future. And the curse, no one believed her. Imagine the exhaustion of watching disaster approach slowly, clearly, like a ship drifting toward rocks, and having everyone around you smile politely and ignore you. Cassandra's life reads like one long, exasperated sigh. She spoke truths that could have saved cities, guided armies, prevented tragedy, but no one listened. Her story isn't about madness, though later writers sometimes painted it that way. It's about clarity without power, knowing without influence, wisdom rendered useless in a world that preferred pleasant lies. Cassandra's quiet despair floats through the myths like a thin fog, soft, persistent, impossible to disperse. And while we're drifting through these slow-burning tragedies, we can't ignore Helen of Troy, a woman who didn't actually do anything wrong, but spent thousands of years being blamed for a war she never asked for. Ancient poets romanticized her beauty as though it were some cosmic weapon, forgetting that Helen was a human character in a story written by men who loved turning women into metaphors. Helen's fault wasn't a choice. It was simply existing inside a world that constantly projected meaning onto her. She didn't wage war. She didn't command armies. She didn't start a feud. But because she was symbolic, everyone else decided she must have caused everything. Her story is less about beauty and more about the strange way societies treat individuals as emblems instead of people. Helen's quiet sorrow isn't dramatic. It's weary. The kind of exhaustion that comes from being misunderstood for a very, very long time. And as we continue drifting through these dim, candlelit hallways of ancient storytelling, we'll meet more characters, more quiet tragedies, more accidental disasters, more humans caught in a web of choices they didn't fully understand. Moving along this sleepy corridor of old Greek stories, we eventually reach the quiet figure of Patroclus, a man whose life feels like a soft echo beside the thunder of Achilles. Patroclus wasn't the strongest, or the loudest, or the most dramatic person in those old tales. He was gentle, careful, the kind of person who tries to hold things together quietly while louder personalities tear everything apart. His bond with Achilles has been interpreted in many ways by many different storytellers, but one thing remains clear across every version. Patroclus was the calm voice in the room, the steadying influence, the one person who could look at Achilles, blistering anger, and say, "Breathe." And maybe that's why his life feels so tragically heavy. He spent so much time trying to protect others, especially Achilles, that he walked straight into danger himself. He put on Achilles' armor thinking he could scare the Trojan army back, buying time. But ancient stories aren't kind to gentle hearts. And Patroclus' fate becomes the hinge on which the rest of the war turns. His story is a reminder that sometimes the quietest people end up carrying the heaviest consequences of other people's storms. And near him, like a shadow shaped into a man, stands Hector, the Prince of Troy. Hector is one of those characters who feels almost too grounded for the world he lived in. He wasn't chasing glory for himself. He wasn't obsessed with legacy or fame. He simply supported his city, protected his family, and tried to be responsible in a narrative that had no space for responsible people. Hector's sadness is slow and steady, like a heavy blanket settling on a tired man's shoulders. Every version of his story shows him trying, really trying, to balance duty and family. There's something deeply human in the way he holds his infant son in the old epics, smiling softly, even though he knows the world outside is collapsing in slow motion. He didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted to keep everything from falling apart. And the ancient storytellers, who loved irony almost more than anything else, placed him right in the center of a war he never asked for. Floating a little further, we come to Andromache, Hector's wife, whose entire life in the stories reads like a long whisper of grief. She wasn't a queen by ambition, but by circumstance, and she spent most of her narrative holding a family together while the world dissolved around her. If the Trojan War was a storm, Andromache was the woman trying to keep the doors from blowing off their hinges. She saw the warning signs long before others admitted them. She begged Hector not to go back into battle gently, lovingly, and he refused, because Greek characters rarely listen to the people who love them most. Her story lingers, soft, quiet, an aftertaste of sorrow that refuses to fade. In many ways, she carries the emotional weight of the entire Trojan tragedy. And then, drifting through the haze, we meet Aeneas, a solemn figure whose story takes him far beyond Troy. Aeneas isn't fiery like Achilles or clever like Odysseus. He's patient, determined in a slow, quiet way, more enduring than inspiring. He watches his city fall. He carries his father on his back. He leads survivors away, not out of ambition but out of duty. He spends most of his time in the myths wandering, searching for a new beginning while carrying all the old endings with him. Aeneas' tragedy isn't dramatic shouting or heroic sacrifice. It's the dull ache of responsibility, the kind that sits on the chest and never fully lifts. He represents the tired kind of strength, the version that keeps going because stopping is not an option. And then, almost unexpectedly, we meet Penelope, waiting quietly in Ithaca. Her life isn't filled with battles or adventures or dramatic quests. Her entire story is one long stretch of patience, the kind of patience that could put modern meditation apps out of business. While Odysseus wandered seas, islands, and storms, Penelope navigated a much smaller but equally exhausting battlefield, her own home. Suitors crowded her hall, pressuring her to remarry. She deflected them with cleverness, kindness, and a weaving trick so subtle it almost feels like a metaphor for endurance itself, weaving by day, unraveling by night. She wasn't praised for heroism, though she had more of it than many of the men in her story. She wasn't awarded glory, though her loyalty was the thread that kept Ithaca from unraveling. Her life is a study in quiet resilience, the kind that doesn't seek applause. Gliding forward, we run into Electra, a character wrapped in long-standing grief. Her father's death shattered her world, and she lived in the shadow of that event, trapped in a house full of tension, suspicion, and unresolved anger. Electra didn't have armies or ships or prophecies shaping her story. She had memory, pain, and a fierce devotion to someone she lost. The ancient playwrights wrote her as a woman who carried her grief like a vow, refusing to let it fade even as everyone else tried to move on. Her story isn't fast. It's slow, heavy, the kind of narrative that unfolds like a dimly lit room where every step feels like it echoes. And right beside her, balancing that tension, is Orestes, her brother, whose own life turns into a spiral of consequences he wasn't prepared for. He returns home to a tangle of family conflict, betrayal, and emotional debris, and the story places the weight of resolution on his shoulders long before he's ready for it. Orestes' tragedy isn't just what he does, but how little control he has over the forces pushing him forward. He becomes the central figure in a cycle of revenge older than himself, and his voice in the stories has this tired, hollow quality, like someone walking through a fog they can't see out of. And as we continue floating through these old tales, we find more lives shaped by sorrow, misunderstanding, duty, or the quiet collapse of hope. Ancient Greek storytellers excelled at crafting characters who weren't just symbols, but reflections of how heavy human emotions can become when stretched across years. And as we continue floating through this gentle procession of unfortunate ancient characters, we eventually meet Priam, the elderly king of Troy, a man who spent most of his life watching other people make decisions that he then had to suffer the consequences of. Priam wasn't a warrior. He wasn't impulsive. He wasn't even particularly dramatic. He was just tired, the kind of tired that seeps into your bones and stays there for decades. He lived long enough to witness joy, loss, rebuilding, and then the slow, agonizing unraveling of everything he'd worked for. The storytellers describe him walking through the city, leaning on a staff, offering advice no one really wanted to hear, because the younger generation always imagines it knows better. He's that soft-spoken elder whose wisdom is overshadowed by louder voices. And the saddest part, Priam's downfall wasn't caused by his own mistakes. It was shaped by the choices of others, especially his son Paris, whose questionable judgment set in motion events far beyond Priam's control. Priam's entire life reads like one long lesson in patience, resignation, and the quiet suffering of someone who tries their best while the world around them refuses to cooperate. Drifting a little further, we find Andromache, another silent casualty of the Great War. She wasn't a queen by birth, wasn't a warrior, wasn't someone the poets wrote long epics about. She was simply Hector's wife, loyal, gentle, and painfully aware of the cost of conflict. Ancient storytellers describe her walking along the walls of Troy, holding her child, scanning the battlefield for her husband's figure, fearing the worst every time the dust rose. Her entire story is a slow unfolding of grief. She foresaw what would happen, feared it deeply, and lived through every dreadful prediction anyway. Andromache didn't try to rewrite destiny or protest loudly. She just endured quietly, steadily, the way countless unseen figures in history have endured tragedy without applause. And if we drift sideways from grief into the territory of fragile pride, we end up beside Paris, the prince whose life can best be summarized as too many emotions, not enough foresight. Paris wasn't malicious. He wasn't cruel. He was simply overwhelmed. The ancient poets described him as gentle, handsome, and more interested in enjoying life than in considering the long-term implications of his actions. When he made choices, he made them like someone picking fruit at a marketplace, impulsively, guided by whatever looked appealing in the moment. And the tragedy is that he didn't understand the weight of his decisions until it was far too late. Paris' story isn't dramatic noise. It's a soft, melancholy tune about a man who wanted simple joys and stumbled into catastrophe instead. Floating away from Troy now, slowly, like a leaf drifting on late autumn wind, we find Antigone, one of the most quietly powerful characters in Greek literature. She wasn't a warrior or a queen. She was just a daughter determined to honor her family. Her life was shaped by a simple belief that loyalty should matter more than politics. But ancient playwrights loved putting principled people into impossible situations. Antigone's story is calm, almost meditative, but heavy with that particular kind of sadness that comes from knowing you're right and realizing that being right won't protect you. Her determination doesn't blaze. It glows, steady, soft, inevitable. And then there's Ismene, her sister, who often gets overlooked but deserves her own moment. Ismene was gentle, cautious, the kind of person who wanted to do the right thing but was terrified of consequences. Her story is the quiet one, not bold, not rebellious, not famous, but it's human. Ismene represents all the people who whisper their worries, who tremble at the thought of defying authority, who love deeply but fear loss even more. Her tragedy is subtle. She is overshadowed not because she lacked courage, but because the story she lived in only celebrated loud defiance, not quiet concern. Now we wander toward Deianira, the wife of Heracles, and again, we're dealing with the human, literary version of Heracles, not anything supernatural. Deianira's life was defined by insecurity, not because she was weak, but because she loved someone who was rarely home, rarely emotionally available, and rarely capable of giving her peace of mind. Ancient storytellers paint her as tender-hearted, deeply anxious, always fearing that her husband's wandering life would eventually leave her behind. And in an attempt to hold on to love, she made a mistake, one based on misinformation, fear, and desperation. Her story is a soft tragedy about loneliness inside a marriage, about the way anxiety can twist hope into ruin. Let's keep drifting, quietly, toward Electra, whose life is one long, slow-burning ache. She lived in a household cracked open by betrayal, loss, and revenge. But unlike the dramatic versions portrayed in plays, the quieter versions of her story emphasize her exhaustion, a young woman trying to navigate grief without any stable ground to stand on. Her days were filled with uncertainty. Her house was full of tension. Her memories were full of shadows. Electra is one of those characters whose suffering doesn't erupt, it simmers. You can almost imagine her moving through the palace halls, shoulders tense, voice low, eyes tired, someone who grew up too fast because life didn't wait for her to be ready. And nearby stands Orestes, her brother, another character shaped by expectation and sorrow. Like many figures in Greek storytelling, he wasn't choosing freely. He was reacting, pushed forward by a chain of events set long before he was old enough to understand them. The most human thing about Orestes is his uncertainty. He hesitated, doubted, questioned, traits rarely highlighted in heroic tales, but quietly present under the surface. His story isn't about bravery, it's about surviving the aftermath of other people's choices, wandering, seeking advice, fearing judgment. Orestes is the ancient equivalent of someone trying to break generational trauma with nothing but a shaky sense of duty. As the candlelight of these old stories flickers, more characters wait in the next quiet corner of the narrative, more fragile hearts, more soft tragedies, more lonely figures trapped in stories bigger than themselves. And as we continue, let's meet Helen, not the one who caused a war everyone thinks of her that way, but the quieter version, the woman behind the myth. Her beauty is famous, but her agency is complicated. Ancient storytellers suggest she didn't ask for Troy, didn't plan the chaos. She drifted along like a leaf caught in a storm. Her story isn't loud. It's about the quiet weight of being blamed for everything while actually being just another human trying to survive. Nearby is Menelaus, husband of Helen, a man whose reputation could be summarized as loudly reactive. He is, in many ways, the opposite of our softer characters. He rages, he demands, he organizes armies. But under the surface, there is doubt, weariness, and fear. He spends years chasing vengeance, not out of hatred, but because history and honor leave him little room to simply sigh. Menelaus' life is a curious mixture of noise and private anxiety, the kind that makes his occasional heroic moments feel almost accidental. And drifting past them, we find Penelope's son, Telemachus, who grew up in a house that taught patience in the most exhausting ways possible. He wasn't yet a man when Odysseus disappeared, and he wasn't yet a king when his father returned. His story is one of awkward growth, quiet observation, and the odd, clumsy courage that happens when a young person must step into the shadow of legends without fully understanding what legends actually entail. Now, moving toward the wider Greek world, we encounter Alcestis, who offers herself in place of her husband. Unlike most heroes, she is not praised for battle or cunning. She is praised for an endurance so quiet it almost vanishes in the telling. Her story isn't about victory. It's about self-effacement, about quiet courage that doesn't make the front lines but still touches the very edges of what we call heroism. And then there is Admetus, her husband, the man whose life is partly saved by someone else's quiet suffering. Admetus' gratitude is complicated by guilt, by awareness, and by the realization that life sometimes unfolds in ways that highlight your own mediocrity or misjudgment. He doesn't appear in stories as a tragic figure, but if you look closely, he's a study in how people survive by the kindness or sacrifice of others. We can't skip the women of Troy entirely, of course. Cassandra's sister Polyxena, for instance, who, like so many others, is described almost entirely through the lens of someone else's decisions. She is brave enough to exist, quietly aware of her family's doom, and tragically caught in the machinery of fate. Her story is more of a whisper than a shout, a reminder that history rewards the loud and forgets the steady.